if you have any kind of, hey, so hello everyone. We are actually just about to start. I'm here with Ben and Jessica. They will introduce themselves. I would say that we are recording this session, so you'll be able to watch it after on YouTube. And if you have any kind of questions or topics that you want us to talk about, just leave a comment. Either it's Zoom or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever you are watching it. Just feel free to leave some comments and questions, and we'll try our best to address them. Daniel is here collecting all your questions and comments for all the platforms. So wherever you are, you're more than invited to leave your comments and questions and thoughts and whatever. That said, I think we can start. So I'm here today with Ben and Jessica, and I'll be happy to hear something about yourself. I'll start with Ben.
Hey, so yeah, I'm Ben Dechrai. I'm currently head of developer relations at a startup called ArcJet. We're a security middleware layer. I came from Sonar before this and Auth0 before that. So I've always been in the security privacy space. It's something I really enjoy. And yeah, it's an exciting field.
The connection between security and developer. It's exciting, but a little scary, yeah.
Totally scary, but so worthwhile.
Oh yeah. And now for you, Jessica.
Yeah. Ben, I love like the deep breath around security of like, yes, it is scary, but worthwhile. It was, you could feel the pain that we've all felt.
I think we've all
security breach happening. Hi everybody. My name is Jessica West. Currently I am a co-founder of Developer Experience Institute with my friend Jeremy, who might be tuning in. So hey Jeremy, across the crowd, and doing building tools for developers can make their experience a lot better or even a little bit better on the internet, and doing some consulting along with that. So working with everything from early stage startups to larger companies to try and help bring a better developer experience for all those devs out there.
Yeah, great. So I know Jessica via Jeremy. I know Jeremy from the community for a long time, and I met you, I think it was KubeCon that they introduced us each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the main question, since this topic of the main topic of this live stream is about developer experience, before we are actually diving into the deep details of developer experience, what is your personal definition for developer experience?
Yeah, good question. It's something that's like a big debate between Jeremy and I. And I think that, like, the big thing when I think about developer experience really is like that's the journey of developers as they like learn and deploy technology. And then when that is successful, like when you have got a good developer experience, that's basically eliminating all all the things that hinder a developer or practitioner from achieving success in their endeavors.
Oh yeah, I sound some echo maybe.
I know, I just heard that. I'm not sure what happened.
Oh yeah, I think it's something happened in the computer, but we're good.
Okay.
Do you keep hearing that?
Not anymore. I only heard it briefly.
Great. So I think that's a very good definition. Okay. But since you said that you have something that Jeremy said, I think that also give Ben the chance to say, what is personal definition for developer experience?
So I think when I think about experiences of any sort, I'm very much the kind of person that if you're going to buy me a gift, buy me an experience, not an item. So when I think about experiences, it's about the feeling that people have in a certain situation. I think developer experience basically is like, how do our developers feel when they're using our product? And that then spans across the whole life cycle from first finding out about it during requirements analysis all the way through to how well are they supported. So I think it's just, if you had to boil it down to like, I can't count words in my head before I've said them, a number of words, it would basically be like, how do they feel? Do they feel good using your product or your service?
I think that you both actually mentioned one thing in common, milestones and life cycle. So you both agree is like giving a good experience around the life cycle is the milestone. What kind of milestone do you refer to? Is there a closed set of milestone that we can think about?
So I think there's actually two bigger areas of, so you've got the software development lifecycle, but then you've also got the the outreach lifecycle, perhaps. So you'll find, especially from a traditional marketing sense, like when you're trying to get people to find out about your tools and services, marketers will often talk about touch points. How often do you reach out to them? And that's usually through things like billboards and whatever else. When it comes to developer experience, it's less about the overt marketing side of things and more just about helping developers understand how you're there for them, making sure you're there for developers where they are. They're not going to come to you, but you go out to the Stack Overflows and the Discords and so getting them to feel who you are and what kind of a product company, what kind of ethics you have, all of these things kind of built up into before they've even looked at your product for the first time. And then you've got the software development lifecycle where they're like, okay, cool, I've heard about it. Now I'm actually going to try it out in a product. I'm going to go through the development process. How do I do the testing? Is there a CI/CD pipeline? What's the maintenance look like? All of those kind of things fit into the software development lifecycle. But I think there's a whole punch before that even starts in terms of how you interact with your community.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I would like to return to that soon. But before, I saw that you, Jessica, had something to say about the milestones and life cycle. So
yeah, I guess it's very similar to Ben's. To me, when I think about it, there's like three main touch points, and one of them very much is what Ben touched on. Is I think what marketers will talk about, the kind of the pipeline or the awareness part, and that's really when developers are thinking about like they have a need that's been identified and like they start researching like how do I solve this problem, whether it's immediate or they're trying to make an improvement. What's some of that first experience the developer has with your solution, whether that be in your community, how your content is on your website, like how easy is it to navigate things, like all that is like this big milestone to decide, am I going to continue going through? Like that's that first impression. Is it good? Is it really bad? Is it okay? Like, are you intrigued? And you're kind of got that big milestone. Past that is then when you're beginning your software like development lifecycle and you're bringing the product in, you're reading documentation, like how can you get started? What are some of those error messages that you get when you're getting started? And all of those things really contribute to that good developer experience. And then the final bit is that it feels weird to say at the end or kind of towards the end of the software development lifecycle because that assumes there's an end, but it's more on like the maintenance part of it, which Ben, I believe, spoke with as well. And that's, when we have these big releases that we do, how is that experience to the developer? Like, how is it to maintain that solution and how does it go on and how are updates communicated? And that's a big thing for one, like, are they going to keep their solution? How does it make them feel? And like, those are those three kind of main points that I identify and think about.
So what I hear is more like a continuous.
Yeah.
Jess, I think you're muted or something. I missed your last sentence.
Oh, I think I nodded. I didn't say anything.
Okay. So yeah. So what I say is like, I hear more like a continuous approach for developer experience. Do not try to limit yourself for a particular milestone, but always like track and observe what I can now improve in the experience with the developer that I work or other work. And I think Ben mentioned an interesting point that there is part of developer experience that is more inbound developer experience, or more like, how do I bring people to my product? But there is also an aspect or perspective of developer experience, which is like not really outbound, but for the internal developer experience, right? So this kind of two domain, do you think they are tightly related or we should differentiate each other?
In my opinion, I don't think that, I think you can differentiate the way that you're maybe speaking to different departments and people that are helping bring that together. But if we think about like developer experience as a whole, it comes back to the very first thing that like Ben mentioned is really, it's the experience of the developer, right? And that doesn't, like, as a developer, when I'm checking something out and looking at it and then bringing it through the deployment process and maintaining, I haven't changed identities, right? Maybe in a bigger team, I'm passing it on and I'm still going to be part of that process, but I'm experiencing that thing, end to end. And it's that continuous experience that I'm having. So I think it really should be thought about that in that larger umbrella. But of course, it's involving a lot of different stakeholders and conversations.
Yeah,
I would agree. I think
Mhm.
the goal of the developer experience, developer advocate, community support, whatever aspect you're looking at, the goal is the same. You still have developers using a tool, whether it's an internal tool or an external tool, external developers, doesn't really matter. I think one of the advantages you have, though, when you're looking at internal developer relations or developer advocacy is that the conversations can be very different. There's a lot more context. There's a lot more openness and vulnerability. You can push back and say, look, this really isn't going to happen because our roadmap is so full at the moment. Whereas outbound to a public community, you probably want to have a different way of communicating those things. So I think while the goal is the same, there are very different practices to achieving that goal.
Got it. So you said, and if we actually looking at these practices, probably they are also related to, let's say, priorities. So if I'm like platform engineer trying to have better developer experience in my organization, it's probably different if I'm developing a developer platform and I want to let my users or my customers, right, like different kind of experience. Got it. So
yeah,
it's all about priority, but we need to think the same about both, no matter if we just engineering leaders that are trying to deliver a good experience for our developers or business leaders that are trying to give a good developer product for our customers or users. I think that's a good point to do the right prioritization. I want to jump a little deeper because I know Ben already mentioned it, and I know that sometimes developer experience connected to the point of application security. I created some content around it. I saw that other people, and I know that the company that Ben I work for, ArcJet, is trying to deal in that role. Do you think that developer experience directly can solve application security challenges? And I'll start with you, Ben.
Directly is interesting. I guess so, in a way. I think, so there's this saying that developers hate security. And I think there's probably about half of the people listening to this who go, yeah, you're right. And the other half who say, no, I like security. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it's a bit of a throwaway comment because it's not that developers necessarily don't like it. I think I just put a double negative in there. But anyway, it's not that developers don't necessarily hate security. It's that we love to create new things, right? We're creating features. We're pushing value into a product. Most developers probably love a greenfields project. Some of them love working on legacy applications, but it's not about adding security unless you're working on an actual security product. In the same way as most people don't want to do payments, we use other tools for that. So the developer experience around security can be directly impacted by good tooling that allows the developer to be lazy. And I often say developers want to be lazy, and I don't mean that in any kind of just kick back and don't actually do anything kind of a way. I think a lazy developer is actually more effective than a developer who's overly taxed and overly having to think about everything. If you can alleviate certain aspects, you can concentrate on what you're actually good at. It's the same in most industries. So I think if we want to allow developers to be that lazy person, then we need good tools, systems, processes, whatever it is, that enhance that user experience. That then mean that they don't need to worry about security as much, but still be aware of it.
That's interesting. Just you have something to add on it? Have you ever got this friction between security that's solved with developer experience?
Yeah, I'll say so. So my background from like a software engineer, not a security engineer, and then going into developer relations, I can speak to it from that respect. And I think that like anytime creating software like actively, it's security. I wouldn't say like I'm scared of it, but I'm always aware, and I'm aware that I do not have the knowledge to make all the decisions on my own, if that makes sense. So I rely heavily on tools and teams to help me with that. And so not only like I'm not always in a team that has a whole security expert or everything's documented. So to me, when I think about developer experience and security and how it goes together, it's really about how we make it easy for best practices up front and like paving those roads to be secure from the very beginning. And we have so many great tools out there for that, that if you can enable, like you as a software developer, you can have a tool that enables you to have good security from the very beginning and have that part of like, like I have a command on my CLI that I run and it easily like takes all my secrets and handles it, saves as a variable in the very beginning, like a very basic security thing that we learned from 101, don't hard code your things, all the way through to like scanning analysis from like in my CI/CD pipeline later on before I deploy it. I'm going to rely on those tools to keep me secure, right? So that's why it's so important for us to have that right tool there. And I think in that sense, that then goes back to your initial question, is that you can have good DevEx that impacts security, but it comes back to like how easy is that tool to use, how available and how much information is there available to me to know about that tool, and to then have it in my tool set of everything I'm working on. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this point is very interesting. I think we can get a sticker for it from Ben, like a good developer is a lazy developer, because it's something
efficient.
Oh, yeah.
I think they're both the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm just like, we'll just use efficient so we don't upset anybody.
Sure. Oh, I like upsetting people sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's
only for fun, though.
But I think that's a very interesting point, because there is say in application security that bad experience is the worst security vulnerability you want to have. Because if your users will have bad experience in the application, they will try to find a way to hack it. Now, it's depend how advanced is your users, but they will try to find a way to hack and, trying to bypass security feature. And what I hear from you is like a good developer experience that create good experience can create more efficient software development lifecycle or more lazy software development lifecycle that will make the developers adopt security better or adapt to security better. What kind of, I mean, Jessica, you said that you're not only from the security. What kind of other domain you think that we can make it easy for developers by tooling or by providing good experience in tooling?
I think to me, the biggest thing is making sure you have a really good tool in your CI/CD pipeline, to be honest, because that's like, I think one of like my first like lessons I learned as like a junior dev is not to save my variables like in my code. So like that's to me, I'm like, okay, you did it. Like that's the very basic one. But the things that I rely on and that I would use is having the tool that's scanning that vulnerability. And so I'd worked for a security company before, but I didn't go deep in, and I wasn't working as an engineer on that product. So I think like that again, like rely on tools that I'm aware of that to add into my process to do that work for me. And that is partially for me, reading content and checking out like what is the best thing for me to do, like, and what's the most secure, and kind of looking into the security of that security company, like how many hacks have they had, and what does that look like for me to then trust all my data with them. It's the right line with like what you said, like with payments, or kind of it's anytime we're dealing with that sensitive data. And I don't want to be held on the hook for it. I also don't want like a page at middle of the night for something that went wrong. So yes, I'm going to be kind of very particular about when I'm looking at those tools.
I think that what you mentioned, for example, regarding storing secrets, right? This is thing that everyone make mistake of. Even like senior developers, sometimes they not think of a secret or environment variable as something that is environment, and then they store it in the code. And then when someone, not even a secret, right? It can be just an environment that need to change from time to time, from deployment to deployment, and they are forget. And when you mentioned that, I thought also about something else, something that's not necessarily related to security, something like audit logs or observability logs, that tools with a good experience, with a good developer experience, with nice SDKs, with something that is really seamless when you are, or they give you the right practices on how to imply them, how to incorporate them with your code, can create you better observability layer to your application, because they are giving you. So my question is that if you're both thinking about more domains or more areas that good tooling and good experience can help us create, open new horizons for applications.
I think one thing rather than new horizons, if we look at different domains of how good DX can help an organization internally, no matter what they're doing. Jessica touched on the idea of, as a new junior developer coming into a team, I think one of the biggest advantages we don't necessarily always think of is the onboarding process. Onboarding somebody to look at your code for the first time, it's, depending on your company, you might think, yeah, cool, we've done this before, we've got good feedback. Sometimes you're like, you know what, it takes somebody a couple of weeks just to understand what's going on under the hood. And I think if you have good tooling, good developer experience around the tools that you use, again, whether they're internal or external or third-party hosted, whatever it is you're using, if the experience of using those is really nice, then developers are going to have a lot more fun learning about new things as they join the company. And they're less likely to, I don't know, put in a workaround because they don't understand the documentation, and then suddenly security vulnerabilities kind of get in from the ground up. But I think in terms of domains, there are probably other business domains for sure. But I think in terms of just the points of the development team, not lifecycle, there's a lot of places where this DX has a huge impact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point on that onboarding point, because you've got not only onboarding to a new tool that you're using, but you also you have the onboarding onto the internal team. Like, what are the best practices for the company that you're working for? And like, how do we do things? And it's so tough because like in any kind of startup, we were talking about this a little bit, backstage before we came on, about the hustle that you have, especially at startups. And how many of us have been employed at startups, either now or in the past, where you're just trying to get things done as quickly as possible. And sometimes things like internal onboarding or these kind of internal processes slip. And then we can, like, that causes some friction down the road, right? Because maybe something doesn't get handled or it gets forgotten or not documented in that internal onboarding, let alone from another tool that you're going on. So it's so important to be like thinking about those things, not only from an experience perspective, but as a vulnerability area, and what we can be doing to make sure that's really safe, especially depending on what data we're working with.
Yeah. The onboarding idea is actually a very interesting one. I mean, I haven't joined the developer team for a while now, but I remember that where I joined, sometimes you're getting hired, for example, without a specific domain expertise, right? So for example, you are joining a Go language team because you are good in backend, but he not necessarily knows how Go work. And it's actually a case that was as part of my career. I joined a team that used to develop in Go language since its early days. They started a product in 2015 and decided to do it with Go. And I joined in 2019, and Go has some interpretation since then, but they are always very early Go developers. So when you are going to read something in the internet, you're getting a very different picture from what you are actually saying in the code, and you don't have anywhere to learn about. And if they can think about this learning and onboarding experience as part of developer experience, and maybe use some tools that maybe this tool does not exist. Maybe it's just an idea for a new startup, for a new dev tool startup, for something that can track the code, can read a little in the internet, and can guide new developers in the team for the particular code base and how actually we can work on it. And I think it's a good point to discuss the responsibilities of a platform team or whatever internal team to make sure how is the DevEx for the internal, not like the inbound DevEx. What do you think, Ben, is the responsibilities of platform teams in terms of developer experience?
I think with everything kind of, we hear shift left all the time. So platform is something that developers have to care about nowadays as well, even in small part. And there's obviously still going to be a platform team that takes care of the platform itself. But we're so much more, as developers, we're so much more intrinsically linked to the whole process that if we don't understand how a certain feature that we're using within the platform or a certain process within the CI/CD pipeline works, then we might inadvertently be coding around that, or we might inadvertently do things that aren't going to be in the best interest of the deployment process. It might actually undo some of the things that the platform team are doing. So I think there's a lot more. I think when it comes to that, especially when you're talking internally, it comes down a lot to communication. And communication is a large part of developer experience. There are many ways of communicating developer experience from an external perspective, but internally, I think a lot more has to be that about mutual understanding between teams.
So with the platform team working on their communication, they can create the first building block for a good experience for the team.
Correct. I mean, we've probably all been around in. I first started software development back in, I don't know, the early 2000s. And from whether it was a platform or the testing team, there was this concept of throwing it over the wall, where a developer would bundle up their code and they're like, lob it at the testing team, and now the testing team will have to handle what have you. And then they throw it back. But the communication was really bad. It was basically, here's some stuff, and now as a developer, I don't need to care about it anymore. It's the testing team's problem or the platform team's problem. And DevOps had played a huge part in breaking down that silo between these teams. And I think that plays directly into good developer experience as well, because communication, or at least an understanding of what each of the teams is doing and how your actions impact them, is very important.
Yeah, I mean, I now hear the communication as part of the experience, and I think it's important for every kind of team that try, to be a good platform team. It's not about the tooling or the way the tooling works, it's about how do you communicate. What do you think, Jessica? What kind of responsibilities platform engineering should have for better developer experience?
Well, a lot of actually what I was going to answer, Ben indicated, so I don't want to repeat too much, but I will say +1 to a lot of his points. And I think kind of doubling down on a few things, I think that the communication and how things are, both like from a human perspective and also kind of a computer to computer is so important. And when a lot of times when I've worked with teams that are, we'll say, kind of adjacent to core engineering, whether it be a platform engineering team or a DevEx team or a DevRel team, what I always tell them is that, I feel like we're kind of that first experience, like as a developer, like we're going to see that first before it's released, out into the world. And so we're always trying to make sure like our communication is really, really compact, like concrete and compact back to someone else, that they understand exactly what's happening. And also, feedback is a beautiful practice to work on. And, and things like that, it's so important to have that integral part of it's an extension of the software development lifecycle, right? Is how are we taking that communication and bringing it back into like what's going on with that tool and how to make it better. But from the platform engineering point, I just think it's a really important team, and it's great seeing that get more, also popularity, I think, in the past 10 years. So, because it really thinks about like, how are we thinking about this as a whole? And how are we bringing this experience from, again, like that end-to-end experience, and how can we make that better? And so I think that their role is pretty crucial in everything. And we don't have that in every single company, right? But there'll be some that are kind of act as that hybrid. So hopefully that helps answer.
I think in a continue to that, and I think maybe that's even more relevant to the other side. Sometimes your work in developer experience is connecting the dots. So Ben mentioned it about, connecting with the different teams in the organization, but sometimes your role or your responsibility as someone who wants to make sure developer experience is smooth in the organization is connecting, for example, between front end and back end, right? Teams. So to make the connection point between them seamless and stuff like that. But what do you think about it? Do you think this practice is possible? Is the responsibility of the team themselves? It's something that should come from outside?
I mean, I think it's absolutely possible, and I've seen it happen in really well-oiled and really poorly oiled, we'll say, and the friction that happens for the both. But I think for a good one, it actually starts a little bit with the company culture, and how well that communication is happening between teams, and whether that's from the manager or from the executives or whichever. It's like how much do we encourage communication between the departments, and collaboration between the two, and how much do we really care about that developer experience, right? Because if the company culture and the executives are saying like this, the absolute most important thing is for our developers to have a good experience. Number one, like that's what we want to do. We want to provide the best product, the best developer experience. Well, that's going to start in so many different ways, and how developers are taking their time to really code and think about even things like naming variables or documenting things or creating these responses that we create, like that we get from hitting their API. All that comes into how they think they can work, right? Are they encouraged to rush through and take some shortcuts? Are they encouraged to find like the best product, or like an MVP, and iterate and collaborate with other people to learn more, and to understand that? So I think that's how like you have like that peak developer experience is starting there with like that company culture, and how that's trickled down.
Company culture is
on,
yeah.
I was going to say, Jessica touched on an interesting point there at the end with, I mean, all of them were interesting, but specifically one of the ones at the end there was around like the things that the developers care about. At the end of the day, when we're writing software, code is code, and we're all writing software in some way. But if we're looking at front-end and back-end developers, another big part of that good experience is about addressing their needs. We might represent a process or a tool or something that helps with a certain aspect, but how people then use that is different. A front-end developer, for example, is probably going to value an experience that allows them to rapidly iterate on whatever they're working on, get some kind of visual testing tooling, whereas a back-end developer is more likely to value something that adds rigor and security and performance monitoring and all of those kind of things at the back end. So we also need to, while communication is important, it's important to tailor that to what the recipient actually values for them to be able to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think if I'm thinking about you, Ben, you are more, you don't have the capability as part of your job, and when you do developer experience, you don't have the capability to worry for the company culture, right? You're selling to various companies. And yet in developer platforms, and I also experience it as Permit. So we are doing our authorization platform, and most of the times we need to touch in multiple teams in organization. One team is, let's say, a DevOps team that need, to implement, to deploy the sidecars, to do the policy decision, and one team is the backend team. But it could be more teams. We have also things for front-end teams. How do you connect the dots when you can't worry about the company culture or whatever? What is the developer experience formula to make sure that external team that you have zero control on collaborate with each other?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer is that you're right. You don't worry about that culture because you can't control it. It's not technically, it's not actually any of your business. That company decides to have a certain culture, good or bad or indifferent. And you do have multiple touch points with different people in the organization. I have actually been in the position where I have been almost a mediator, I guess, between people at a different company, where they're like, well, I can't talk to so-and-so because whatever. And I'm like, well, why can't managers talking to them? So you get to the point where you actually become a little bit of a counselor sometimes. In mediating that for them, but that's not something that's intrinsic to developer experience. That's just something that sometimes you end up doing. Every job has these weird little side tangents that you go down. And you're like, I wasn't supposed to be a veterinary surgeon this weekend, but hey, there was a dog that needed my help. There's all sorts of times in our lives when we do things outside of our roles, and there can be a lot of value in doing that. But in terms of like, what's the role of developer experience, or at least leading the developer experience for a product when you're reaching out to other companies. I think if the experience is such that developers enjoy using the product and they feel supported and the documentation's there to help them self-serve and all of those things, then largely the internal issues shouldn't extend beyond the boundary of that organization.
Yeah,
so that was clear, but I think I'll waffle a little towards the end.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the way that first you understand that you can't control, and then you're taking the action, which is a good strategy for many things with live. I think not
Right.
only for bridging good experience for developers. I'm trying to think of it, more for the practical implementation details. So, for example, you can, for example, bridging SDKs between each other, or trying to have a good touch point between teams. Do you think it's something feasible when you develop, let's take an SDK, for example. Do you think it's feasible to trying via your SDK connecting the teams, create touch points between the teams?
Are you asking Ben or I? I thought that was directed towards Ben, so I was pausing.
Oh yeah.
No, go ahead, Jess. If you've got a thought on it, I'm still processing that one.
Okay. I'd say kind of processing, like live processing as we go here.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about this team was on, and I was hired as part of the front end team, but I was really curious about some of the back end work. And the back end engineers were like very senior and working through some stuff. And going through that, we had to write some like new services to really bridge the gap between like what we were showing to the customer and then how we were taking data. And my manager at the time decided to create like these kind of hybrid teams. And so we had like the front end and the back end engineer, and we were pairing on like how do we make sure things are communicated properly between the two services, and grading that through. And I feel like I learned a lot in that project, and one actually that inspired me to learn a lot more on the back end side of things, which created kind of my like love for Erlang and Elixir, which is a whole other tangent I will not go on. But going through that process, I think it was a really good kind of practice of showcasing like that communication starting again just with that team, or like working and collaborating, and then talking about how we can have those two services speaking with one another. And I think there's been whole companies kind of spun up about how to mash things together. If we look at back in the day with mashering and a few other things, like we can absolutely have that communication moving forward. It's just, I think, a matter of taking the requirements from both ends, from the front end and the back end teams, and making sure that those are honored, sounds like a big word there, but adhered to within that contractual agreement.
Yeah, maybe like make assumption where will be the touch point that, for example, backend and frontend will collaborate with each other and trying to easier these touch points. So for example, if your SDK allowing to connect something from the frontend to the backend, so assuming that usually backend teams are more seniors than front-end team, or at least more seniors in calling or creating APIs. So you can, in the backend team, in the front-end SDKs, do the things that communicate with API easier than what it is in the backend SDKs. And then in the backend SDKs, the things that, creating maybe asynchronous traffic to the front and make it easier in the backend than in the front end. So that's a good, I think, assumption you can do. I actually, Ben, I saw that you love processing, but I think ArcJet is kind of great example for that, because at some point ArcJet is breaking a friction between security team and, let's say, backend team, right? So you need at some form, as I understand it, ArcJet creating a communication channel between two different teams that you don't know. You don't know the nature. You don't know if they love or hate each other. You don't know. And so you already start to see that. You already start to see external different team communication that you can help them with experience, create more.
Cool. I mean, one of the things that ArcJet lets you do is for developers to do the security, to embed that middleware themselves. There's a whole lot of reporting for the back end the security teams will probably love. There's logging, and we fit into CI/CD pipelines, and in a way, those two teams, not necessarily just within the example of ArcJet, but within other examples too, those two teams don't necessarily need to communicate anymore. But what you're doing is you're actually creating an additional communication channel, which I think is what you're referring to. You're creating a way for the security team to be aware of what's happening, to be included in the loop, without actually having to confer with the developers. Like, presumably it's a tool that's been vetted as a vendor that you want to use, and it's integrated, the whole company's on board with using it. So at that point, the use and the benefit touches multiple teams, even if it's only actually integrated at one point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all, I mean, as a DevRel, I think one of the most interesting point in our job is look at other teams and understand, their dynamics, and how can I help them create them a company culture. Sorry. I think that's a good point to talk about low code and no code tools in terms of developer experience. We talk about connecting the dots between various software development, but at some point we would also like to connect the dots between software developer and people who are not touching the code. Or we want to give the developers a cloud platform that they can manage easily. Not all the developers really like dark mode and CLIs. Some of them just like to go into a website and see the status of something. Do you think developer experience is also part of working on such no-code and low-code tools or platforms?
Sure. The panacea of let's go directly all the way to no code is that anybody can write software now, because you're not actually writing software anymore. But we're already seeing low code being a thing that many developers rely on. You could even argue that using a GPT to help write you code is a form of low code, in that you're not writing it, it's being generated, and then you're just plugging it in. Don't copy and paste, folks. Understand the code. But there's a huge impact in that on developer experience, because on the one hand, you're making it easier for them. But on the other hand, you're also kind of locking away the actual what's going on under the hood, which on the one hand makes me a little nervous. Like, I don't want to implement code that I don't understand how it works, but it is also the general direction we're going in. And as we gain more rigor in that space, and the code that we as developers are using in a no code or low code scenario is something we can more easily trust, then that's going to improve the experience tremendously.
That's a perspective that I never thought about. So, like the new thing that created will allow us create some new experiences. Jessica, are you experienced with like providing kind of no code, low code developer experience?
A little bit. I'll say, just from the implementation perspective. I think the thing that keys in for me that Ben talked about is the trust aspect. I want to believe that, like, whatever I choose, like the low code thing will, whatever solution I choose will be okay, and it'll get the job done. I do have a little bit of like some anxiety when I think about like what data I'm passing to, because I don't know if it's okay or what it's going to do, or I don't know like where it's going to fall down. Right. So to me, like, my experience there is like, well, what happens when it goes wrong? Like, how is that being communicated to me? And I know that that's definitely a place where we're heading. Like, more and more, there's more tools out there, and it is more efficient, right? If I'm not having to build a scraper or do something from my own and shove it into a database and clean it and do all these things, that's going to save me time. But it's hard to just say, like, blindly trust whatever tool to say and assume that that's the right thing. And I think that is something that I wonder with like this like kind of the generation of developers coming in now in the future, if that'll be a change, like if they will have more trust towards those versus like myself or Ben or you, Gabe. Like, all of us have been here before that happened. And so I don't know if that's just by default, like, because as a software developer, you question everything and you're trying to think through that. That's just this job. It just attracts those kind of people. or if it's also just an experience point of not being kind of surrounded by those from the very beginning of your software creation lifecycle.
Yeah.
So
You know
that's
what
how I
think?
kind of have been thinking about it.
I think it's an old person's problem. I think basically what Jessica's saying is we're all old. Because if you think about, for example, I don't know, your 80-year-old uncle who won't use the calendar on his phone because he's like, I'm going to write it down because I know that works. Like we all look at these people and we say, oh, come on, of course it works. It's fine. And yet here we are saying, you know what? I don't trust this thing. I'm going to do it the old way. We've turned into old people.
I didn't even, I walked into that completely. But yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, actually, I say that from my perspective, low code is not only code that actually builds pieces of your software. I can look at, Permit or Architect or whatever developer platform, or some sort of low code, right? I'm saving you hundreds or thousands of lines of code that you need to manage and deploy, but I'm giving you like a platform that's doing it, either as SDK or as UI. And something interesting that we saw at Permit is the more the company matured, the more the users matured, the more the market being more educated, then we need to shift the areas that we invest from, sometimes from low code to SDK. So so for example, we started Permit 3.5 years ago, mostly 3.5 years ago, and 2 years ago, OpenFGA, if you're familiar, it's just a fine-grained authorization tool, start growth and hype in the market, in the open source market. And they help us. We do a lot of market education, right? I mean, sometimes our competitor thank us that we do the market education instead of them, but we do a lot of market education. And you see more and more people. So every conference we go, we see more and more people that actually more educated in the field of fine-grained authorization. And it seems like that things the developer will want to consume via UI 2 years ago, now they want to consume it via the SDK because they are more familiar with the terms, they're more familiar with how to work with stuff. But on the other side, so for example, in the side that where they do deployment or where they check some stuff that were available only in the code, they now want it in the UI. They want it as a low code, as a traditional low code, no code. So, and to your point, Ben, regarding like we are getting old, yeah, that's true. We can't control it, right? We can't just accept it. But I think that the main point is around looking at the market and the not being old while the market getting young, not about the people that are young, because sometimes or many times when we do software development, when we do developer tools, the market is growing very fast or changing very fast. And we need just to track these changes and maybe understand what kind of platform do you want to deliver now? Where we will deliver the best experience at this point. If we're looking at the market, we look at the how people trying to consume this particular field, and then trying to have a better. I want to look at this no code or like UI developer tools from another perspective. I saw some tools that actually require developers, to look at them every day, not like observability tools, because that's most of the people actually like to consume it via the UI. Do you think that developers are already ready to consume a significant part of their software development, not from code, but from UI or graphic UI or stuff like that?
I think so. I think
Yeah.
If I wanted to stand up a new website today and I chose some front-end framework and a database backend and I don't know, some authorization server, I would guess maybe 80% of all of that configuration is already through UI. I would sign up for the authorization service of choice and the database, and all of that is point and click. I think we're already there.
You're not that older.
Say again?
No, I'm joking. I think the point that you mentioned here, it's interesting because you mentioned like when I start something new, right?
Mhm.
Which is in the experience perspective, I think it's very different starting something new, starting a new service, starting a new, then executing something, right? The experience that we need to provide in.
True. And you're right that once it's all stood up and you're then adding features and all of that, there's a lot more code that comes into it, but you're still heavily reliant on those interfaces. If I want to change, if I want to add if I want to enable login with Google, that's still something that I do through a point and click interface. If I want to go and change the backup options for my database, or I want to do multi-region, or I need to distribute the database across multiple instances, all of that is done usually through interfaces. There are CLIs that are coming out, and they're good. A lot of people do prefer to work in the command line, but we're already used to answer the question of, are we ready for this? I think we have been ready for it for a while.
So you think like in the different milestone, you need actually different tools and different perspective. What do you think about it, Jessica?
I think Ben's spot on for the point of that. Ready feels like a question that's not as relevant, because I think we have been living in this for a while and getting data. Like if we think about, it's kind of like the first, well, I don't know, I guess for me, like when I'm thinking about UIs that I got data from that I use in my software development lifecycle, I think about all the stuff that I get from AWS's monster of panels, right? Of like, I like log in there and see all the different services, and I've been in there plenty of times configuring and changing things, and then using that later on, right? I think that and we've been using that for quite some time, and it's funny when you were talking about no code, low code. I hadn't really thought about things like the AWS panel, or from that, I was thinking more like Airtable, for example, or like things like that. Like that, I don't think of this as like as a tool, but something that I could then easily like do some small configuration and give to like someone in product, like be like, hey, like here's the thing now does what you need, and you can make changes, and they feel comfortable because they don't have a code background. So I think that actually expands a lot more of things, but from like a UI and getting data, because we have been there for a while, right? Like it's something that we do. And then that's where we think about like the user experience and developer experience from the very beginning of like how easy is it to navigate that? And how quickly can I get information? And then it becomes like less of a trust issue or challenge, because it's like a known, assuming it's a known entity, and it's more like a understanding and how to integrate that into whatever your project is.
That's a good point.
I think something that's important, if we go on the premise that we're used to user experience, user interfaces for a lot of things already. And one of the reasons why CLI is so popular now is we need to make sure we don't go too far that direction. Because I remember there was and this is definitely going to age me, there was a saying that a mouse is basically a device for pointing at the X window that you want to type in, which comes from the Unix days when the mouse wasn't really used for much. Everything was on the keyboard. That's why a lot of people my age still like Vim. Point and click can slow some people down. It's really easy to learn how to use it. You don't have to learn all the ins and outs of another kind of interface. It's very intuitive, but it is slower and it's not automatable. So we need to make sure that whatever we're doing in terms of low code, no code, interfaces, drag and drop, all of these kind of things, that it can be automated, that it can be scripted. Because if you don't allow that, then you're basically putting, that's a huge impact on developer experience to start with. Because developers don't want to, every time they stand up a local development environment, have to configure a whole lot of things and point and click. Just run a script, make yourself a coffee, cup of tea, glass of milk, whatever you enjoy, and come back and it's all ready to go. So we need to make sure that it's not only user interfaces.
Yeah. I appreciate that point about the CLI too, because something that I still kind of appreciate being able to change and manipulate what I need and having it build. And also I had a hard time not just completely laughing over you when you said a glass of milk. Like that was what I really needed to get right now in between while I was waiting for my test and everything to build.
Absolutely. Got to get that calcium in.
A cup of milk.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't forget the cookie.
Yeah.
developer calls.
Yeah.
So we are actually 4 minutes to finish. So to our
Time
end,
flies when
yeah,
you're
that
having fun.
was fun. Yeah, absolutely. I think that also learned a lot of insights about the field. I mean, it's very interesting field, I'll say. If someone has any questions, so that's the last minutes. In the meantime that we are waiting for questions and talking about developer experience, do you think that there is a need or there is a real position called developer experience engineer or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are. I don't know if I think sometimes it can look different at different companies, as do many titles and things that line up.
And
But I definitely have seen like developer experience engineers at places. There could be like a whole team just on that, depending on what kind of company it is, and that could be specifically thinking about more on like maybe on the platform side of things, or what are the responses that you're getting back, or it could be more on like a developer experience engineer that's more like a let's call them like a higher tech DevRel person. You know, they're like they are in like that kind of different, like whether it's in product or marketing or wherever a DevRel team's formed. There could be a developer experience engineer that is specifically trying to go break things and trying to see like what is that experience, and then providing that feedback to the engineering team that built it or helping be part of that. So I think that those are the two that I've seen embedded in different teams. And I've hired one, so I guess I'm a little biased.
If I'm a company now and I'm asking you, Jessica, do we need developer experience engineer? What are kind of the problem that you'd tell me, if you have this and this and this, then you need that?
I think before that, I'd ask a couple other questions about like, what's your current setup and how do you receive feedback? Like, where do you go? Like, do you have any team thinking about it? But if you don't have, if you don't have anybody thinking about that kind of top level, you should probably get a few of them, and you should absolutely hire them. And also I'm available for consulting to help you get there. And so, but I think, one of the things you're looking at is like, what is your documentation looking like? How robust is that? How many people are complaining? Like, how many complaints do you have on Stack Overflow right now from people not being able to understand what's going on? Like, like looking at just some basic data points, like what's happening behind the hood. And then, I mean, it's helpful for everybody.
So maybe the right question is, do you have the skill to listen to developers today? If you don't, you should have a function that actually will listen to developers.
Basically, like, how are you hearing from your developers and your developer community, and what do your current engineers think about your product? Like, how are they communicating and talking about it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to create a conclusion. So if you want to do a good developer experience, then you need to learn to listen and work on your communication. That's the basics. And from then you'll just find tons of things to do to improve experience.
It's amazing what you find out when you listen.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we just reached our end of the hour, which was really fun. And we probably were so clear that people do not have any kind of questions. Thank you for joining me today.
Perfect.
If you have anything you want to say before we are ending. Great.
No,
So
it's been great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. The conversation flew by, so I hope everybody enjoyed it as well. It was great.
Perfect. And we all on LinkedIn, if you wanted to connect, we all with the name, Jessica, the same name. Yeah. So just look at our name in the Zoom or wherever you are, and we can connect. We can, if you have any kind of after question, you can reach out. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.